Hi, folks. It's me again, Ian-Khara Ellasante, your guide, as we consider the Maine Humanities Council's big question of the year, what if? My pronouns are they and them. I'm an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies and Africana at Bates College, and I am ready to take a deeper dive with you into the potential of the big question, what if? And so this time, I'd like to introduce the question of what if there were no gender? Now, like many what if questions, this is one in which it's really helpful to ponder what we might gain, but also what we might lose if this what if were actually reality. So first, before we get into this big question of what if there were no gender, it's best that we establish a working idea of gender. So what gender is and what gender is not. So as we are building a definition, I invite you to keep the big question in mind. So what if we lived in a world in which there were no gender? To build a definition, or better yet, a description, we'll be looking at one rather simple way to visually conceptualize gender, which is with a spectrum, which looks a little bit like this. Let's see here. All right. So this spectrum or this set here, this does move us a bit beyond thinking of gender as two boxes like these, which represents a basic, a very simple and rather boring, in my opinion, binary. So notice, however, that this spectrum and others like it is still based on a binary conceptualization of gender. Because there's this huge range in the middle of ways to be, um, the extremes or the poles at either end still represent and underscore two genders. And perhaps at these extremes, we're thinking about these genders as their most socially normative. So I acknowledge that the spectrum concept is a helpful first step for thinking beyond a simple and boring binary of gender, but it still does not manage the spectrum. It still does not manage to hold or convey the vast range of actual human experiences of gender. But next time, though, we're going to take a look at some other and more creative ways to visually conceptualize gender. But for now, we're going to stick with our spectrum. Um, and at its simplest, as we're thinking about gender, at its simplest, we can think about gender as social versus sex, which is physical or biological. So gender is not the same as biological or anatomical sex, contrary to what a lot of people want to continue to believe. In other words, to put it simply and maybe kind of crudely, gender does not equal genitals. Um, of course, when we're thinking of biological sex, and let me share with you again here. Let's see here. I feel like I'm at a command center here. All right, when we are thinking of biological sex, we are typically, well, we have to consider more than genitals. Genitals matter because sex does involve both external and internal reproductive anatomy, of course, but it also involves chromosomes and hormones. And all of these are taken into account when determining biological sex. And really, even though we often tend to think of sex as the fundamental human binary, we tend to think that every human is either only male or female. Science, along with real human bodies and real human experiences, especially those of intersex people, have proven that the idea of sex is far more complicated than this old binary here. Now, when we think of sex, what we are usually thinking of is the sex that someone was assigned at birth, which is in the extreme majority of cases based on the appearance of a baby's genitals. So that when a baby is born with what appears to be a vulva, that baby is assigned female at birth. And a baby born with what appears to be a penis is assigned male at birth. However, the assignment of sex at birth really never just stops there. Um, Let me share with you once again. Yeah, so when sex is assigned at birth, the assignment of sex at birth also comes with an assignment of gender. So if a baby is assigned male at birth, the social expectation is that this child will be a boy and will identify as a boy and will be mostly interested in the things that our society deems to be masculine things, and that they will reject those things that our society deems to be feminine things, that they will grow up, they will become a man, and they will fulfill, at least in part, the roles that our society has designated as acceptable roles for men, which include being romantically and sexually attracted to women. Of course, the same is true on the other end of the spectrum. So if a baby is assigned female at birth, based on a visual inspection of this baby's genitals, then that baby is also assigned the social role of a girl. The social expectation is then that this child will identify as a girl, that she will be mostly drawn to the things that our society has deemed feminine, that she will mostly reject those things that our society has deemed masculine, and that she will grow up to be a woman, and she will fulfill the roles that our society has designated as acceptable roles for women, including the expectation that she is romantically and sexually attracted to men. So through these rather basic illustrations, we see that gender includes the sexual expectations that overlay birth assigned sex. So again, just as physical sex is assigned at birth, so too is social gender assigned at birth. So let's pause for a quick what if moment. Now, what if gender were not assigned at birth? Hmm. What if the social norm was to allow children or all people, regardless of their sex, to inform those around them when and if they determine their own gender for themselves, rather than having their gender assigned to them upon being born? What might that be like if our world, if our society were structured in that way? How would that be? Still, as it stands, physical sex designation and social gender, the social gender that's associated with that physical sex, are both assigned at birth. But let's go a little bit deeper here, because sure, societies and cultures have their own rather strong ideas and expectations about gender and the acceptable roles and behaviors that accompany gender. Even as we see all too often, social penalties for gender nonconformity and the inverse, social rewards for gender conformity. But gender is far more than just social. It's also very individual. So, gender also includes the ways in which we as individuals experience gender for ourselves, how we interact with gender, and how we identify our own gender in our own hearts and minds. We can think of this as gender identity. So often a person's gender identity matches up with the gender that they were assigned at birth, and they might feel, for the most part, an alignment with the social expectations that come along with that gender assignment. Another person, however, might feel that there's a mismatch between how they experience and identify their gender and the ways that society expects them to experience and behave in their gender, including the roles that they are expected to fulfill and the ways that they're expected to inhabit their body. So, how about another what if break here? Another little what if break. So, what if you identified with a gender different from your current gender? What do you imagine would be different? How might your family and friends respond? What do you imagine would be the most difficult aspects of this? What do you imagine might be fun or joyful about it? And how do you imagine you might express yourself? So that leads us to gender expression. So, gender expression is a way to think about all the ways in which gender is legible or readable to others. It's also the ways in which we as individuals show or express our gender identity. Um, for many people, gender expression is a really important part of how they navigate the world. Um, there are other people maybe who feel like they could care less about their gender expression. Gender expression can include things like the clothes and accessories we wear, how we style our hair, the ways we talk and gesture and move our bodies, the name or names that we use, and the pronouns that we want others to use when referring to us. Pretty much any part of our gender that interfaces with society can be thought of as a communication or an expression of gender. Now, it's important to note here before we leave the topic of gender expression that not everyone's gender expression aligns with their actual gender identity. And this is the case quite often, in fact. And for a number of reasons, people may intentionally communicate or signal gender in ways that don't reflect how they truly feel about their own gender. For instance, a person who was assigned male at birth and therefore, of course, also assigned the gender of boy or man, boy and man, this person may have a gender identity that is more aligned with being a woman. Yet, maybe in order to survive in a hostile family environment or hostile work environment, this person has decided to express their gender in ways that we consider more masculine, despite their gender identity as a woman. Now, speaking of hostile environments, earlier, I mentioned that there are social penalties for those who do not conform to the gendered expectations of a given society or culture, just as there are rewards for those who do conform. So let's take a look here at some examples. So similar but not the same, similar to the example that I was just talking about, let's say we have a person who was assigned male at birth, yet this person identifies their gender as a woman and they express their gender a bit more on the feminine end of the spectrum, and their sexual orientation is more toward people who identify as women. Consider the social penalties that this person would have to confront simply to exist as their authentic self. What kinds of social penalties come to mind for you that this person would have to navigate, would have to confront? All right, let's consider another example. So we have here a person who is assigned female at birth, yet identifies their gender as non-binary or genderqueer. They express their gender somewhere on the range of the masculine end of the spectrum, or what our society would consider the masculine end of the spectrum. And their sexual orientation is toward a range of genders. Now, consider the social penalties that this person might face for living as their authentic self. What kinds of penalties come to mind for this example? Are they different from the penalties faced by the person who was assigned male at birth? Can you think of any social rewards this person might receive for the ways in which they identify or express their gender? Which leads us to some questions to ponder. What do you think is the purpose of these systems that reward gender conformity and punish gender nonconformity? How might systems like these have originated? And why do they persist? In what ways do you think these systems harm or damage society as a whole? And a much trickier question here, in what ways do you think such systems serve or benefit our society? Some more what if questions for you to be thinking through until we meet again. What if there were no gender in the ways we now know it? What would change in society? What would change in families, in religions, in healthcare, in education? What would we gain? What would we lose? So we've got now some of the basics, some of the fundamentals of gender laid out here. And we are beginning to consider some big questions of why and what if. And next time, we will start to consider some other ways to think of gender, to think differently about gender, and to ponder whether we actually need gender like this at all. So I will see you then.